Montana, 1884. There are things a man says without thinking that turn out to be the truest things he has ever said. Not the careful words, not the ones rehearsed on the ride into town or the ones chosen slowly at the kitchen table while the lamp burns low. The ones that arrive without permission, the ones that come out of the mouth before the mind has had any say in the matter at all. Those are the ones that last. Those are the ones a woman carries for the rest of her life, folded small and kept somewhere near the center of everything. I was 51 years old the autumn I said it. My name is Henry Graves, and I had been running the Graves cattle operation outside of Millhaven, Montana, since I was 23 years old, when my father handed me the deed and a handshake and said, "Good luck. Boy, this land is harder than it looks." He was right about that. 28 years of hard Montana winters, of cattle lost to cold and flood and the particular cruelty of a season that gives no explanations. 28 years of fence lines and feed bills and the kind of slow satisfaction that comes from building something real with your hands and your will and your stubbornness. I was not a man who complained. I was not a man who explained himself much either. I worked the land, kept my word, and came home every evening to a house that was quieter than it had been built to be. My wife Eleanor died in the spring of 1879. Not suddenly. The fever took its time, the way fevers do when they intend to be thorough. She had been the warmth of every room she entered, Eleanor. Not in a performed way, not in the way of women who understand that warmth is expected of them. In the true way, the kind that simply is what it is, the way the sun is warm without deciding to be. After she was gone, I buried her under the aspen grove east of the house and went back to work the next morning because the cattle did not know she was gone and I did not know what else to do with my hands. 5 years had passed since then. The aspen grove was still there. The house was still quiet, and I had made a kind of peace with the quiet, the way you make peace with things that are not going to change regardless of what you feel about them. Her name was Frances Dunmore. She was 44 years old and had come to Millhaven in the summer of 1884 from somewhere in Oregon that she did not talk about often, which told me more than any amount of talking would have. She had a daughter, 12-year-old Ada, who had her mother's eyes and her mother's particular way of going still when she was thinking. Frances had bought the Hendricks property on the western edge of the valley, 40 acres of good grass and a creek called Birch Run that fed into the larger river 2 miles south. The house needed work. The barn needed more. She had arrived with enough money to buy the land and not much else, which meant she had come with the intention of making the land work rather than waiting to see if it would. I knew this because the feed store in Millhaven was where everyone's business became known eventually, and because Frances Dunmore came in on a Thursday in July and ordered supplies with the focused efficiency of a woman who had counted her money more than once that morning and knew exactly what she could and could not afford. She was not asking for sympathy. She was not explaining herself to anyone. She wrote her order on a folded piece of paper and handed it to young Thomas at the counter with the certainty of someone who has done the math and is not interested in discussing it. I was at the counter buying nails I needed and rope I also needed and standing approximately 3 feet from a woman I had never seen before, who was managing her business with the quiet competence of someone who had been managing things alone for a long time. I noticed her hands first. That is always the first thing I notice about a person, because hands tell you what a life has actually been. Her hands were capable. Not rough from neglect, capable from use. There is a difference, and it matters. She turned and found me standing there, and her expression was entirely neutral, the practiced neutralness of a woman who is in a new place and has not yet established what is safe to let people see. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," I said. And that was the whole of it. She collected her order and left. I bought my nails and rope and went home and did not think about her again until the following Tuesday when her fence came down. The east section of the Hendricks property fence had been a problem since old Hendricks had let it go in his last 2 years. One good rain loosened the posts and a strong wind did the rest. I was riding the creek road when I saw it. 3 sections of fence down and Frances Dunmore in a gray work dress hauling posts from the back of a wagon by herself with Ada standing at the horse's head holding the reins. She did not call out when she saw me. She kept working. I dismounted anyway. "I can help with that," I said. She straightened and looked at me. She did not say she didn't need help. She said, "I have a post driver in the wagon." That was the conversation. We worked through the afternoon, she and I and Ada, who turned out to have strong arms for a 12-year-old and opinions about the proper depth of a fence post that were largely correct. Frances said almost nothing that was not about the fence. Neither did I. We worked, and the fence went back up, and when we were done, she said, "I'm Frances Dunmore." I said, "Henry Graves. I'm the next ranch east." She nodded once. "Thank you, Henry Graves," she said, and she meant it the way practical people mean things, plainly and without decoration. I rode home in the early dark and told my dog Biscuit, who was old and had the philosophical disposition of an animal that has survived too many Montana winters to be surprised by anything, that the Hendricks place had a new owner. Biscuit was not particularly moved by this information. I was more moved than I admitted even to the dog. September came, and with it the first cold and the particular quality of Montana light in early autumn, that long, golden, slanted light that makes everything look like a memory even while you are standing in it. I found reasons to ride the creek road more than the creek road strictly required. This was not something I examined directly. I simply found that the post needed checking, or the water level at Birch Run was worth monitoring, or some other reasonable and entirely transparent purpose that brought me past the Dunmore property on a Tuesday morning. She was always working. That was the first thing you could say about Frances Dunmore, and the truest thing. She was repairing the barn roof when I passed one morning. She was extending the kitchen garden the next week, turning the ground with a spade with the slow, serious attention of someone who understands that the quality of your soil determines the quality of your winter. She was teaching Ada to read a water line along the creek edge, showing the girl how to see where the ground stayed damp in late summer, which meant underground moisture worth knowing about. I stopped one morning with fence posts in my wagon, left over from my own fall repairs, and told her the east corner of her property could use 2 more. She said she'd been meaning to get to it. I said I had the posts already. She considered this for a moment, long enough that I understood she was not simply deciding about fence posts. Then she said, "All right." We worked the corner together, and this time the conversation moved past the fence. She had come from a town called Harney in Oregon. She had run a dry goods store there with her husband for 11 years. Her husband Robert had died 2 years ago, a heart that gave out at 40, which was not something anyone had seen coming. She said this with the directness of someone who has told the story enough times that the grief has settled into a fact, still present, just no longer raw. She had sold the store and the house and brought Ada west to Montana because, she said, she had always believed that land was something you owned and a business was something that could be taken from you, and she wanted to own something. I understood that. I told her so. She looked at me sideways in the way she sometimes did, a brief, assessing look, as if she was checking whether the understanding was genuine or performed. It was genuine. She seemed to conclude that. Before we go any further, if this story is settling into you the way a good fire does, go ahead and hit subscribe and leave a like. It costs you nothing, and it means the world. Now, let's get back to Henry and Frances. October was when the town started having opinions. Small towns in Montana in 1884 had a particular relationship with the business of their neighbors, which is to say they considered it shared property. Ruth Alcott at the dry goods store told me directly on a Wednesday morning in October that she thought it was good that Frances Dunmore was getting settled in and that the Hendricks property would benefit from a woman who knew what she was doing. She told me this while I was buying coffee, which suggested she was not actually talking about the property. I bought my coffee and said nothing, and left before Ruth could finish the thought she was building. My neighbor Tom Greaves, no relation, was less careful. Tom was 58 years old and had been married to the same woman for 34 years and had formed strong opinions about what other people's marriages should look like based entirely on his own. He found me on a Friday afternoon replacing the water line on the north pasture and told me that Frances Dunmore was a respectable woman and that a respectable woman in a new place needed stability and that a man who was going to ride past a woman's fence line every other Tuesday ought to have intentions worth having. I looked at him. He looked at the water line. Eventually, he left. The rival arrived in November. His name was Daniel Proctor, and he ran the largest cattle operation in the county, 3,000 acres to the south of the valley, and he was 42 years old and had been a widower for 6 years and had been looking, as the town put it, for some time. He heard about Frances Dunmore from his foreman, who had heard about her from Ruth Alcott, and he rode to the Dunmore property on a Saturday morning with a jar of honey from his hives and the pleasant, easy confidence of a man accustomed to being well received. I heard this from Ada, who told me the following Tuesday with the careful neutrality of a 12-year-old who has decided not to have an opinion until she knows more. She said the man had been very polite, and her mother had thanked him for the honey and offered him coffee, and they had talked on the porch for 40 minutes. She said she did not know what they had talked about. She said this while looking at me in a way that suggested she knew exactly what she was telling me. I rode home and told Biscuit about Daniel Proctor. Biscuit sighed in a way that was not without judgment. I spent 3 days not thinking about it, which meant I spent 3 days thinking about almost nothing else. I was 51 years old. Eleanor had been gone 5 years. I had made peace with the quiet, I told myself, and the peace was real, and the quiet was manageable, and Frances Dunmore was 44 years old and practical, and had her own land and her own daughter, and had not once given me any reason to believe she was waiting for me to say something. Not once. Except that she had started leaving the gate to the lower pasture unlatched on Tuesday mornings, which meant I had to stop and latch it when I rode past, and she was usually in the yard when I did. I latched the gate on a Tuesday in November, and she came across the yard, and I looked at her in the November light, which is a particular light, thin and clear and not forgiving of anything. Her hair had come partly loose from its pins. There was mud on her boots from the garden. She was wearing an old coat that had been good once and still was, the way certain things are good long past their prime because they were well made from the start. She was not a young woman. She was 44 years old, and she carried 44 years on her face, honestly, not apologetically, just honestly. The way the mountains carry their years. The way the valley carries its. And I looked at her standing in the November light with her muddy boots and her loose hair, and I said it before I had any say in the matter. "You're still the prettiest woman in this valley," I said. I had not planned it. I had not rehearsed it. It came out the way true things come out when a man has been not saying them long enough that they lose patience and come out anyway. She looked at me. Something crossed her face that I did not have a name for. Something that moved through her expression too quickly to catalog. And then she tried to smile. She tried, and what came instead, slowly and completely against her will, were tears. Not dramatic tears, not weeping. Just her eyes going bright and then wet, and her mouth holding that almost smile that could not quite complete itself. She turned away fast. "I am sorry," she said to the fence post. She pressed her fingers against her eyes. "I am sorry. That is not." She stopped. She breathed. "I have not been told that," she said finally, her voice steady now, almost, "in a long time." She looked back at me. Her eyes were dry again. She had the composure of a woman who has learned that composure is a thing you choose, not a thing that simply arrives. "Robert was not a man for that kind of saying," she said. "He was a good man. He was not a man for that kind of saying." I had nothing elegant to offer her. "I was not an elegant man," I said. "It is true whether it has been said or not." She looked at me for a long moment. The November light held us both. A hawk crossed the sky above the aspen grove to the east, turned once, and moved south. Then Frances Dunmore said, "Henry Graves, I have been latching that gate myself every Monday night." I looked at her. "I know," I said. She almost smiled again. This time she made it. "Come in," she said. "I have coffee on." I came in. Ada was at the table with her schoolwork and looked up when I came through the door with the expression of a 12-year-old who has been monitoring a situation for several months and is quietly satisfied with how it is developing. She said nothing. She went back to her work. She was, I thought, her mother's daughter in the most complete sense. I stayed 2 hours. When I left, the light was going and the first stars were showing over the ridge, and I walked to my horse and stood there for a moment in the cold Montana evening, understanding that something had shifted in the particular direction of no return, and that I was not sorry about it and had not been for some time, and that the peace I had made with the quiet house was perhaps not the kind of peace I had believed it to be. December came cold. The first hard snow fell on a Monday and stayed. Frances's barn needed insulation on the north wall before the real cold arrived, and she knew it, and she had the lumber but not the extra hands. I showed up on a Wednesday with my ranch hand, Eli, who was 20 and strong and had the sense not to ask questions. We worked the barn wall in 2 days. Frances fed us lunch both days, good food, the kind that comes from someone who cooks as a form of care rather than obligation. Ada talked at lunch with the freedom of a child who has decided you are trustworthy, which I took as a high compliment. She talked about her schoolwork and about a mare named Penny that she was learning to handle, and about whether Montana snow was worse than Oregon snow, a question she answered herself at length without requiring my input. Frances watched her daughter talk and said little, but there was something in the way she watched her that I recognized. The watching of a person who has been the only protection between a child and a hard world, and who is still, even in a safe moment, on watch. It was the watching of a woman who had held things together alone and was not entirely sure yet that she was allowed to set any of it down. After Eli left on the second evening, Frances and I sat at the kitchen table with coffee and the particular quiet of a house after a child has gone to sleep. The stove was good. The snow was steady against the window. She said, "I need to say something to you." I waited. "I am not looking to be taken care of," she said. "I want to be clear about that." I said, I know you ran that store for 11 years and bought this land yourself and put up that fence in July in a gray dress in the August heat." She looked at me. "I am not looking to take care of anyone," I said. "I am looking for company. The honest kind." She was quiet for a moment. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. The stove ticked. Then she said that I might be able to manage. She looked up. That I think I could manage quite well. I went home in the snow that night with Biscuit walking beside me, and the old dog looked up at me once with the expression he sometimes had, the one that required no translation, and I told him he had been right all along, which he acknowledged without excessive celebration, which was his way. Daniel Proctor came back in January with a more formal intention. He was not a bad man. He was a sensible man who saw a capable woman on good land and thought in terms of what made sense. He came on a Saturday with a proposal that was practical and fair and delivered with the confidence of someone who is not expected to be refused. Frances was polite. She was always polite. She told him she was grateful and that she was not in a position to make that kind of decision, which was true in the way that things are true when they are pointed in a particular direction. He left. He was gracious about it, which raised my opinion of him. He did not come back. I asked her in February on a Sunday afternoon. Not because February was romantic. Because I had been going to ask her since November, and I had been slow about it the way I was slow about most things, and I had decided on a Sunday morning that slow was one thing and foolish was another, and I had been edging toward foolish for long enough. I went to the Dunmore property at 2 in the afternoon on a Sunday, and she was on the porch in a coat with a cup of tea because she sometimes sat outside, even in February, because she said the cold air was honest and she preferred honest things. Ada was inside. I could hear her practicing the fiddle through the wall, working the same measure over and over with the patient determination of a girl who intends to master something. Frances looked up when I came through the gate. She looked at my face. She set her cup down. "Henry," she said. I sat in the other chair, the one that had become in some unremarked way my chair, and I looked at the valley in the February light, the snow still heavy on the ground, the Birch Run Creek dark against the white, the mountains showing their full winter above the tree line. I said, "I am going to say this plainly because I am not a man for poetry, and you are not a woman who needs it." She said nothing. I said, "I have been thinking about you since July when I watched you hand that feed order to Thomas without apology for knowing exactly what you needed." I said, "I think you are the most honest person I have met since Eleanor died, and I did not expect to find that again, and I am not willing to let it go past without saying so." I said, "I would like you to be my wife, If you are willing to take on a man who is 51 years old and has a quiet house and a dog named Biscuit and more stubbornness than is probably good for anyone. The fiddle stopped inside the house. I do not know if Ada had been listening. I suspect she had been listening since I came through the gate. Frances looked at the valley for a long moment. Then she looked at me. "Henry Graves," she said, "I have been sitting on this porch in February with cold tea waiting for you to get here for 3 months." I said, "I was thinking it through." She said, "I know you were." She reached across the arm of the chair and took my hand. The valley was white and cold and entirely still, and the creek ran dark along the snow, and above the ridge a hawk turned in the winter air. She said yes. She said it simply, the way she said everything that mattered. Yes. And she held my hand, and we sat on the porch in the February cold and watched the Millhaven Valley hold its snow, and that was enough. That was entirely enough. We were married in April when the snow was finally gone, and the aspen grove east of my house had come into its first leaves, pale green and trembling in the spring wind. Reverend Cole performed the ceremony at the Millhaven Church on a Saturday with the small, genuine crowd of people who had been watching the situation develop for 9 months and felt they had earned the right to be present. Ruth Alcott cried in the third row with the satisfied tears of a woman whose instincts have been vindicated. Tom Greaves stood in the back and said nothing but nodded once when I caught his eye, which, from Tom, was the equivalent of a speech. Ada stood beside her mother in a dress, the color of new leaves, and held a small bunch of wild asters that she had gathered herself that morning from the south meadow, and she had the expression of someone who has not been surprised but is entirely pleased. Frances wore a dress, the color of riverstone in good light, gray-blue and quiet and entirely herself. She walked to me with the unhurried certainty of a woman who has decided something and intends to see it through. I stood at the front of the Millhaven Church and watched her come and thought about July and the feed order and the capable hands and the fence posts in the August heat. And I thought about November and the November light and the words that came out before I had any say in them. And I thought about her trying to smile and crying instead. And I thought that I would spend the rest of my life making sure she had been told enough times to not be surprised by it anymore. We said our vows simply. Reverend Cole kept it short, which was the correct decision. Then we were married. The ranch became ours in the full sense. Not mine with her in it, not hers joined to mine. Ours, the way 2 rivers become 1 river, each bringing what it carries, neither one diminishing the other. She kept the Dunmore property through that first year as Ada's inheritance, which was practical and right. She managed both sets of accounts, which were considerably better inside the first season. I kept the cattle and the fences and the specific knowledge of the land that comes from 28 years of paying close attention. Ada learned to ride Penny with a competence that made old Biscuit raise an eyebrow. She also continued the fiddle, which improved steadily through that first summer until the evenings on the porch had music in them, and a house that had been quiet for 5 years found out what it sounded like full. Our son James arrived in the winter of 1886, named for no one in particular and for both of us in the way that new names sometimes represent a new thing made entirely by the people making it. He was a large, calm baby with his mother's eyes and his father's obstinate refusal to be hurried. And Biscuit, who by then was very old and had earned the right to form strong opinions, approved of him immediately and spent the first month of James's life positioned approximately 6 inches from whatever surface the boy was lying on, which we took as a high endorsement. On an evening in the autumn of our 4th year, Frances and I sat on the porch of the Graves Ranch House, which had stopped being the Graves Ranch House and become simply home some time in the first spring. The valley was going gold. The aspens east of the house had turned and were doing what aspens do in Montana autumn, shaking their leaves in the light as if they cannot quite contain themselves. Ada, 16 now and considerably more serious than she had been, was working at the table inside. Her schoolwork spread wide because she was the kind of student who needed room. James was asleep. Biscuit was gone, buried that past spring under the aspen grove beside Eleanor, because it seemed right to put the things you loved in the same ground. Frances had her tea. I had coffee. We had been having this conversation for 4 years and intended to have it for 40 more. She said, "Henry." I said, "Frances." She said, "Do you remember what you said to me at the gate that November? The one about the valley." I said, "I remember." She said, "I want you to know that I have thought about it every day since. Not because I needed to hear it again, though I did need to hear it again," she said plainly, "but because it was the moment I understood that you were not looking at what you wanted me to be. You were looking at what I actually was." She looked at the valley, the gold aspens, the dark creek, the mountains in their full autumn. "That is not a common thing," she said. "I know it," I said. She took my hand. The valley held us in its autumn light. Somewhere inside, Ada turned a page. The mountains did what they always do. I looked at her in the evening light, this woman of 48 years with her honest face and her capable hands and the life she had carried to Montana in one wagon and set down on 40 acres of creek-bottom grass and made into something real. And I said it again, the same words, not because they needed repeating, but because some things are worth repeating every autumn of your life. "You are still the prettiest woman in this valley," I said. She did not cry this time. She smiled. The full smile, the one that had taken me until November to earn and that I had been earning ever since. "Good," she said. "See that you don't forget it. I have not forgotten it. I do not intend to. Tell me in the comments, what was the moment that got you? Was it November at the gate, or the Monday night she had been latching it herself all along?" Frances Dunmore came to Montana with 40 acres and a daughter and the intention of building something that could not be taken from her. Henry Graves had been building the same thing for 28 years and had made the mistake of confusing what he had built with what he had. He had land. He had cattle. He had a quiet house, which is not the same thing as a good house. It took a woman in a gray dress in August heat to show him the difference, and it took him until November to say what he had known since July, which is the way of men who think carefully and speak slowly and sometimes need the right words to come out without permission before the right moment has officially arrived. She had been latching that gate every Monday night. He had been riding past every Tuesday morning. The gate was never really about the gate. It was about two people who had each decided that being alone was manageable, discovering at the same time and from opposite sides of a fence that manageable was not the same as enough. They were both right about that. They were both, finally, brave enough to act on it. Love does not require grand gestures. It does not require perfect timing. It requires one honest sentence said in November light, and one person willing to cry instead of smile, and another person willing to mean what he said enough to stay until the coffee was gone. Build something worth coming home to. Then let someone in the gate. Until next time, keep riding.